Lonene Ray Rogers, Lonnie to those who loved her most, was a 29-year-old from Saegertown, Pennsylvania. She was deaf and the mother of two. On the night of January 7th, 1981, Lonnie was at home with her children and husband. After putting the kids to bed, Lonnie's husband claimed she left with another man. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Dentzel, and this is Unfound. As the saying goes, unfortunately, none of us will get out of here alive. With life comes death. They are forever intertwined. We will be here, then we will not be here. We will be somewhere else, or we will be nowhere, depending on your belief system. And just like the people who have come before us and left this earth, leaving us with their histories to read, whether they did something world-changing or something more modest. All of us are currently authors, crafting tales that will eventually become our lives, from our births to our deaths. And future humans will look at what we've done and what we achieved and be impressed, amused, or let down. Hey, sometimes things don't go the way we want. Well, in the disappearance of Lonene Rogers, 40 years on, it's still unsolved. But people are trying to change that by rewriting the story. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Linez's website, charleyproject.org. Lonene Rogers got her unique name from her grandfather, whose name was Lonene, but everyone called her Lonnie. She was born essentially deaf due to problems in the womb. However, Lonnie could hear at least a little bit with hearing aids and could talk well enough for others to understand. Lonnie got married and had 2 children. She worked at a hotel as a maid. Her husband, Clinton, was also deaf. He worked at a tool and die factory. Their marriage was rough, with Clinton going to jail due to theft and burglary charges. He could also be abusive to Lonnie and the children. In fact, just days before Lonnie went missing, she told her family she was leaving her husband. So on January 7th, 1981, Lonnie, Clinton, and the children were at home. This was a unique situation due to Lonnie kicking Clinton out of the house in November of the previous year. Lonnie had allowed him to come back for the holiday season so their children could see him. The expectation, though, was Clinton would leave once the new year started. Yet he didn't. That night, January 7th, the children were put to bed. At some point after that, Clinton claims to this day that Lonnie left their apartment and never came back. Because of this, at 3 a.m. on January 8th, he took their 2 children to the babysitters. Clinton told her he was going to look for Lonnie. Lonnie was never seen again. Despite Lonnie's family immediately getting the Pennsylvania State Police involved, no leads could be discovered, including no evidence that violence occurred in the Rogers apartment. I realize there may not be a lot of guessing as to what happened to Lonene Rogers. However, Unfound covers disappearances because they are unsolved, not because they are mysterious. Yet, with any case, the biggest question is always, where is the missing person? I ask you, the audience, to try to answer that question and the following 3 as the interview plays. Number 1, what kind of variable, if any, is inherent in a disappearance when both the victim and a possible suspect are both deaf. Number 2, if something happened in the apartment that night, why did the downstairs neighbors not see or hear anything? And number 3, could more than one person have been involved in Lonnie's disappearance, and have these people maintained a vow of silence for the last 40 years? Lonnie's family absolutely believes foul play occurred in her disappearance. The guest for this episode is Lonnie's daughter, Allison Diker. Unfound News. I have kind of a surprise episode coming up. It will probably air this Monday, November 22nd. I'll be having an in-depth discussion about Steve Pankey and crime in general with a host you all know very well. Right now, I don't want to jinx it. Next, this coming Sunday, November 21st, on the Headline News channel, please look for former guest Kelly Bruce on the show Real Life Nightmare, as it covers the disappearance of Brian Schaefer. As you already know, Kelly is by far the foremost public expert on Brian's case. Finally, I want to wish all of you the happiest of Thanksgivings. I guess that's only for us Americans. What will I be doing on that day? Probably cooking wings. Chicken wings. Where you can find Unfound. Unfound supports accounts on iTunes, Pandora, Audible, Podomatic, Spotify, iHeart, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Deezer, and YouTube. Speaking of YouTube, on Wednesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern, please join us for the Unfound Live Show. Watch, ask questions, and give the show a thumbs up. Contribute to Unfound at patreon.com/Unfound Podcast. This week, I need to thank Marcus. You can also contribute at PayPal, paypal.me/Unfound Podcast. I also need to give a huge shout out to all the people who have monetarily contributed using Super Chat during the live show on Wednesday nights. Thank you for watching, and thank you for donating. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. Merchandise, the books at amazon.com in both ebook and print form. Do not forget the reviews. Shirts at unfound-podcast.myshopify.com, or you can track down my assistant Heather in the Facebook group. Playing cards at makeplayingcards.com/sell/unfound podcast. The website, theunfoundpodcast.com. And please mention Unfound at all true crime websites and forums. Thank you. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the daughter of Lonene Rogers, Allison Diker. Allison, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Before we get into this, I want to remind all the listeners that you were very young at the time in 1981. So a lot of the things we're going to cover in this interview are either things you were told later, once you maybe became old enough to understand some of the situation that went on in 1981, or work that you did as an adult, which of course would have been many years after 1981. So I just want the listeners to understand this before we get deep into this interview, Allison. But first, being that you were young, though, I still have to ask you, what do you remember about your family? And of course, both of your parents were deaf. Do you remember, the first time, did that register as something as a little girl, or is that something you didn't realize that was maybe unique until later? How do you remember that?
So as a young child, I think I just thought it was, a normal way of communication. I did have hearing members of my family as well that I communicated with. So I'm sure that I knew there was a difference with my parents as opposed to hearing people. But I did learn to speak English as well as speak through sign language. So at a very early age, I was actually signing for my father.
Wow.
There's personal home videos like those, 8mm reels where I was signing to him, and I was only like 3, and my mother. So that was kind of neat to see. And I was their ears from day one, probably. So I was signing and doing those things like it was just common. I don't think I really realized that it was anything unique until probably being more submersed in the hearing world and culture at probably around 7 or 8. I realized like people were doing a lot more staring at me, where I just thought this is just what we do. I didn't realize it was a big deal, but things like going to McDonald's and everybody like kind of staring at you, and all I'm doing is ordering a Happy Meal for my brother and myself and what my father wants. And I remember thinking, why do they care what we're eating? Like it didn't really register. And I probably 7 or 8 remembered that, or not remembered, but I felt like, wow, this is different for other people. And I didn't like that attention. I didn't like people like staring at us, and it made me feel like we were different, not in a positive way. And I remember too, like whenever my father would like talk to our teachers and like parent conferences and things like that, I remember I would have to sign, and I would sign like every little word. And American Sign Language is very different than English in that all of the connector words like the and is and those kinds of things aren't used. ASL is great because you just get to the point. Like, for example, if I'm saying to my father, I have to go to the bathroom, I would sign go bathroom, and he would say, okay, go. But when I was in a setting where I was with like hearing people like a teacher, I would literally sign every single word. So for example, instead of saying go bathroom, I would say I need to go to the bathroom. So all of those words were just extra. And I remember him getting so annoyed and saying, stop it, what are you doing? Stop it. And in my mind, I was kind of embarrassed, thinking like that he didn't talk right, and I didn't know why. And I thought like I was helping him, and he got so annoyed, and he's like, I'm deaf, stop it. And I remember thinking, oh, okay. But those experiences made me realize that they're 2 very different worlds.
Yeah. As an example, maybe for most people, maybe we think about when we see sign language is when like I don't know, a famous person or politician is giving a speech, and you see maybe a person sign language. Is that what you're talking about? That kind of sign language? Is that what you call ASL, American Sign Language?
Yes.
That's what that is. Okay.
Right.
Now, maybe the listeners can already understand that you are not deaf, but your parents were. Why were they deaf? What was the situation for both?
So for my mother, she was deaf as a result of something that happened in utero. So she never knew a world that was hearing. Okay. My father, on the other hand, was, the story I was told was that at the age of 3, he was in a very serious car accident and had like brain injury that resulted in hearing loss. So he did hear for the first couple years of his life, and then became what they call hard of hearing for the remainder of his life up until now. Okay.
So 2 different situations.
Very.
Okay. And when we say deaf, could they not hear, neither of them could hear at all? Now we're going to talk about your mother's hearing aids. Were they, deaf at all, like complete silence, or was there maybe something? What do you know?
So I'm not sure of the depth of my mother's ability to hear, but I believe for my father being hard of hearing, and my mother, I don't know the extent, but I know that she wore hearing aids. So the hearing aids helped. It's kind of like an example would be when you're in a pool and you can hear people talking outside of the pool, and it's like kind of garbled and mumbled, but you can hear it.
Yeah.
So a hearing aid only makes that louder. so it makes that garbled noise outside of the pool louder. Okay. So you might be able to understand it a little bit better, but it's still kind of garbled.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
All right, great. Thank you for explaining that. All right, so
sure.
You have two parents, but you also have a brother. He is not deaf either.
Correct.
Okay. So, and we have to remember you're very young at the time, but what do you remember about your mother? Of course, her being deaf, but her personality, her work at the time. What can you tell the listeners about some of those things?
So from what I know is very little, but from what I've been told, and just, family members and friends of hers and different people who have told stories, she was always the life of the party. She was beautiful. She, always had a big smile and was very charismatic. She loved to dance. She was always very friendly, made friends easily, and kind of one of those people that everybody wants to be friends with because she makes you feel good. As far as work was concerned, I'm pretty sure that in the beginning, the intention was that she would be, especially during those times, the typical stay-at-home mom and care for the kids.
Huh.
And I would imagine that's probably what she wanted to do, but they struggled with money. So she did decide to get a job, and the job was cleaning hotel rooms. Now, as far as what she would have wanted to do, the proverbial, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah.
I never had the chance of knowing. I never knew that. It's definitely something I wonder. Had she been given the chance to pick anything she wanted, what would it have been? I don't know.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay. But your father, at the time in 1981, what did he do?
So he did a couple different jobs, but then he landed on, I would say, kind of like a career for 30-some years, I believe. Wow. He worked at the tool and die industry.
Okay.
And when he got that job, I can say that, from what I've heard and what I've learned, he was always a faithful employee, always came to work, always, took any overtime shifts, was a hard worker. I wouldn't say friendly, but in that type of position, you don't need to make friends. So.
Right. Okay, so this was a job where he could, his deafness did not affect. He could do his job and not hear as well as everybody else.
Right. It was probably a benefit. If he's in a big foundry, it's probably a benefit that he didn't hear all that.
Sure. Okay. So your mother's cleaning hotel rooms. Your father's doing that job. How did the two meet? Maybe I should ask you this. Was it a coincidence that they were both deaf and met, or how did they meet? Do you know?
I do know, and it was because they were deaf that they met. They met at the Erie Silent Club, which is a location where people who are deaf or hard of hearing like to kind of congregate and gather and, just be with each other. And I don't know how often they, had events and whatnot, but I know that they met at an event at the Erie Silent Club and kind of just instantly hit it off and started dating pretty much right after they met.
Okay. All right. So it wasn't a coincidence then. They met at a place where deaf people go.
Right.
Okay. All right. And how long were they married at the time of her disappearance in 1981?
They married in 72, so it would have been
9 years.
8 years.
9 years. Okay. All right. So this is what was going on. And being that both your parents worked, did you have a babysitter for you and your brother? What was the situation where I'm guessing there were times when both of your parents were out of the house?
Yes. There was a friend of my mother's, so the babysitter was also deaf. A friend of my mother's babysat us while, she was at work. And I want to say, I don't know this for sure, but I'm just assuming that we were the typical, Monday through Friday during the working hours kind of babysitter. But they were friends.
Okay. All right. We should say You have a brother, he's younger than you are?
Yes.
All right,
Yes.
so his memories of this time of 1981, etc., would be even less than yours.
Correct.
Going
I
back.
was days from being 6 years old, and he was 3.
Okay. All right. All right, let's move on. And the babysitter, the topic is going to come up here in a little bit.
Okay.
What do you remember? Once again, you're barely 6 years old, not even 6 years old, and that would have been right at the time of your mother's disappearance. But so then we'd have to start talking about like 1980, 1979. Of course, you go back to 4 or 5 years old. Do you remember your parents' marriage? Do you remember interaction with them? Did they fight a lot? And maybe for the audience, maybe you need to explain how deaf people argue. And how do they communicate? How do couples communicate like that in being married?
Okay. So I don't have a whole lot of my own memories. I have been told, and I've watched videos and all that kind of stuff, but I do know that they argued a lot. I know that because we lived in a duplex, and the neighbors that lived underneath us said, that there was a lot of banging and they argued a lot. Even on the night that she disappeared, they reported that they heard banging and arguing. And that leads into your question of how do they argue?
Yeah.
So a person who is deaf, I mean, they don't use words, but that doesn't mean they don't use sound.
Okay.
I mean, they probably are loud, just like you and I would be when we're arguing, but it's not necessarily words. They're signing and kind of like yelling at each other, but not a word, more like a guttural sound. They might bang more because that's how deaf people get each other's attention.
Okay.
So, I would imagine, when you're fighting, someone like turns and walks away. And then, the other person, instead of saying, get back here, that's not possible if you're deaf. So they would bang on something, bang their foot, bang their hand on a counter or a door or something. And the vibration of that banging is felt by the other person. And then you get their attention to turn around. So it's kind of a noisy experience, I would think, between the banging and the pounding with your hands, your feet, or just yelling at each other, which would probably not be a pleasant thing for the person who lives underneath them.
Right, of course.
But,
I guess what we're saying here is, maybe we've all lived in an apartment complex or something where we thought the neighbors were a little too loud. But in this particular situation, they were loud because that was part of the way they communicated. Yes. They didn't.
Correct.
Okay. All right, gotcha. All right, so, but maybe it's important, you said something there. They actually lived on the second floor of this.
They did. They were upstairs.
Okay. And so there was a stairway. Is the stairway on the outside or inside of the building? Do you know?
It's the inside, but it's a separate, hallway. So it would go, it was like the stairwell was inside the building.
Okay. So the people downstairs and the people upstairs would enter the same door, but then the people who lived upstairs would go up the stairs and the other people would just stay on the first floor.
I think there's separate entrances.
Oh, separate entrances. Okay.
Yeah. So there's 2 doors. I mean, the apartment still stands today.
Okay.
And it looks just the same, just different colored paint. But there are 2 doors. So there's a door that goes directly into the first floor apartment, and then there's a door right next to it that leads to a stairwell. You open the door and there's stairs that go directly upstairs.
All right,
so there's separate entrances.
And we're going to get into the weather later. What that means is these stairs would never be wet or have snow in them, anything like that. They were out of the elements.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
And were there just 2 apartments in this building, or were there more?
So at the time, I think there were only 2. Today, I think there's 5. But I'm not 100% sure, but they added on to the back, and I don't know when that was. I just know that, when you look on Google, it says there are 5, I think. Okay.
But at the time, your understanding, the way you remember it in 1981, it was just the people who lived on the first floor, and then all of you who lived on the second floor.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And this apartment that you lived in, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, how big was it?
I think it was 2-bedroom, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
Okay.
I think that my brother and I were in the same room, but
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, that's fine. All right, so they live on the second floor, and that'll probably come up a little bit later. So you're there. They're working. You're living there. They've been married for 9 years. You have some vague memories of them communicating, maybe fighting sometimes, what I think all couples do. Nothing unusual about that.
Right.
All right. So let's move up to then that day. And we're going to accept that January 7th, 1981 is the disappearance date. But what do you remember about that day? Do you have any memory of it at all? Were you going back to school? Might you have been in first grade or something, or kindergarten at the time, or what was the situation?
So I believe I was in kindergarten. However, I do know that I went to a babysitter. So I'm not sure whether I went to the babysitter typically and then the babysitter sent me to school just for routine purposes. I'm not sure how that worked, but
Okay.
I would have been in at least kindergarten.
Okay.
Because I was 5 and then about to turn 6.
Yeah. Okay. That would make sense to me
Yes.
as well. Now, I just want to go through this from your point of view. We'll, of course, get into the specifics and what your father said and everything in a bit. But you're there. Of course, you and your brother, I guess, are put to bed that night. Do you remember seeing your mother that night?
I don't.
You don't? Okay.
I don't.
All right. Do you remember being put to bed the night that your mother went missing?
I do not.
Okay. What is your first memory after your mother went missing? That you know is a memory that occurs after she went missing?
I recall, I have a memory of the day that we were brought home, the day after the disappearance.
Okay.
And going into the apartment, and there were people already in our apartment. My father was angry. My grandfather was there. My aunt was there. The police were there, and there was a lot of yelling.
Mm-hmm.
We meaning my younger brother and I, went into the living room, and I remember playing with my Bee Gees record player, trying to distract myself and him, while the adults were in the other room yelling.
Okay.
And that's kind of just like a blip memory, and then what happened after that, I don't have memory of.
Okay, great. And that's all we're concerned about right now, your personal memories, because we're going to talk about what other people told you and what you later and what the babysitter said and everything. So once again, to put this in a timeline, you go to bed and then your next memory is of being back in your apartment and all these adults are there and they're all wondering where your mother is.
Correct.
All right, and there is a space in there that now I want to cover. All right, so that next day, though, your father, though, something that you do not specifically have a memory of, but we know that happened, is you were taken to your babysitters. What do you know about that? What have you learned about that?
So, not from my memory, but what I've learned over the years is that we were brought to the babysitters at 3 a.m, and the babysitter was awoken without being notified because she was hearing impaired. He took us there at 3 a.m. She answers the door and she reports that he is anxious and sweaty, and it was winter and very cold and snowy, and so it was a little odd, but she understands that there's a problem and things are stressful. She takes the children, myself and my brother, and my father tells her that he needs to drop us off because he's going to look for my mother, that she left with another man. Huh. She finds this very odd because she and my mother were very good friends, and I would imagine they would have had a discussion about, said person she was running away with, and she had no knowledge of this. In the morning, she waited until 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning and had her hearing daughter call my grandfather. So then my grandfather, my mother's father, rushes over at some point, I would imagine mid-morning, to the apartment, and there's nothing there. Everything is spotless, beds are made, no dishes anywhere. He says everything was pristine.
How did he get in?
He kicked open the door.
He did. Okay, so he didn't have a key. The babysitter didn't have a key. None of your mother's family had the key. They got over there, went up to the second floor, and kicked it in.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
And once again, I realize you were very young at the time, but what you've learned is that any signs of a struggle, anything broken, anything like that at all?
Nothing.
No.
He said nothing was out of place. Nothing was out of the ordinary or looked different. The only thing that was out of the ordinary, I would say, or that he would say, is that everything was like in its place.
Huh.
You wouldn't think at 3 a.m. that would be your priority to make beds and make sure everything's nice and tidy, but it was.
Okay, so the odd thing about it was everything was in place.
Correct.
All right, it was actually what you might say too neat.
Yes.
Too pristine, too clean, too something, too nice.
Orderly.
Too orderly. Okay. In contrast to the opposite, maybe when you a family with 2 kids and toys laying around and everything else.
Right.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so they're there. You remember being there, and then they're all looking around. Did anybody, once again, to your knowledge, this is not something you would remember at the time, but your knowledge, did any of them try to call your father Clinton at work to see, hey, what's going on here? Any knowledge of that at all?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. All right. So then later...
And to my knowledge, he also didn't say anything at work. To my knowledge, he just went to work, did his thing, and came home like it was any other day.
Okay.
Did not notify people at work that there was a problem at home.
Okay. So, though, eventually, of course, Clinton does come home from work. At that point, had the police already been called?
Yes.
They had. All right. So, I have to say, putting this a little bit together is that your father tells the babysitter, Lonnie ran off. But then she calls your family, and it doesn't seem like your family bought into that story.
Right.
Okay, so that's why they call the police. Obviously, if they really believe she ran off with another man, there would be no reason to call the police, but they did call the police. So Clinton gets home, and what do you understand happened when he did get home?
From what I've been told, when he came home, he was furious that, all these people are in his apartment. I'm sure he saw some damage to the door because my grandfather and my great-grandfather had lived catty-corner to this house. So both of my great-grandparents lived not more than 100 yards from where we were living.
Okay.
So that morning, my grandfather and my great-grandfather were the ones that kicked open the door. So fast forward, when we were coming home, I believe my father went and picked us up from the babysitter and brought us home like he normally would any other time, and was surprised by a bunch of people in the apartment.
All the people waiting for him.
Right. And, angry and questioning him and whatnot. I'm quite sure that, my grandfather was screaming, "Where's my daughter?" and that kind of thing. I can just see the scene in my mind, but at the time, the police did do like a search of his person at the time and checked his wallet.
All right, we'll get into. So they get into. He comes home. They're all there. To your knowledge, does he stick to the same story?
Yes. He said the same exact thing, and has for 40 years said she ran away with another man.
Okay. All right. So he's sticking to the same story. Comes home, does not expect them to be there. Of course, he picked you two up on the way home.
Right.
All right. Do you think that did the babysitter or whoever not give him any warning? Or did these people not know that they were there?
I don't think she would have known.
Okay.
And certainly would not have said, "Hey, I called your father-in-law because I think you did something."
Probably not. Okay, probably not. All right, good point.
Yeah.
All right, so he picks you up, you get home, and this is where you've already talked about, this is your next memory of them all being there, loud voices.
Right.
You're in the other room with your brother trying to entertain him while they're
Right.
all out there and arguing. And, and I'm guessing, did you or the rest of your family, I guess they knew how to sign, being that they had a daughter who couldn't hear, right? So
Right.
were they all were
Right.
they arguing and signing? I'm sure there was words being thrown around too, I'm guessing.
Well, the only non-hearing person would have been my father out of
Right.
that group of people. So they were probably all yelling the hearing people to each other
Mm-hmm.
and at him. He was really good at reading lips. So he just, the other end of the communication would have been harder. But my Aunt Glennie was really good. My mother's sister was really good at signing because she signed with her sister.
Yeah.
I believe my grandfather knew sign, but probably not as well as Glennie did, and she was there too.
All right. So, and then the police are there too.
Correct.
And I'm guessing they don't know how to use sign language.
Right.
And so maybe there was some translating going on there.
I would imagine.
Okay. Very good. What is the police department that answered the call on that day?
I believe it would have been the Pennsylvania State Police, because that is an area that does not have its own police station, unless it was the Meadville Police. I think it was the state police, though. I think the entire duration of the case has been in the hands of the Pennsylvania State Police.
Okay. And we should know that even though, in many descriptions of this disappearance, it says Hayfield Township, Pennsylvania, but what is the mailing address? Meadville, Pennsylvania?
I believe the mailing address would be Saegertown, Pennsylvania, which is right next to Meadville.
All right, Saegertown, Pennsylvania. Thank you. All right, so the police are already there. They're fairly quickly, which is good. Your father has a story that, she took off, and obviously some people are not believing it. The police, do you have any idea, did they just question him there? Did they interrogate him somewhere? Was your father ever, did he ever give the state police or whoever was there a name? John Smith, Harry Brown, anybody who this guy might have been? Do you know anything about any of that from that day?
So, yes. They did interview him as best as they could, try to talk to him and ask questions that day. Yeah. Probably through, the other people connected to my mother that were there that knew how to sign. They let him go. They didn't take him into custody or anything like that. He stayed in the apartment with us that night. Okay. And I believe they, questioned him again at the station, like asked him to come down and answer questions and that kind of thing. And I don't know if there was an interpreter or not. And the police aren't willing to share most of what's in the file, so I don't know.
Okay. Let me ask you this. When they were there, did they ask permission to look at... Now, both your mother and father have their own cars?
They did.
All right. Do you know if the police were allowed to search either car at the time? Do you know if they did that?
I don't know if they did that, but there were two vehicles, and my mother's vehicle was not moved. Okay. My father's was moved because he took it to work and back.
Right. Okay. But you don't know if he gave them permission to search it?
I do not know.
Okay, you don't know. Do you know if your father over the years has ever been asked to take a polygraph test regarding that night into the next morning?
He was asked, and from what I was told, he agreed to do it. And then he began talking to his sister about things, probably when he asked if we could stay with her. And she said, "You need a lawyer, don't do this, don't talk to anybody," and everything kind of just stopped. He then kind of reneged and said, "I'm not doing this. I want a lawyer. I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to anybody." He didn't participate in any searches, didn't do then he was not cooperative at all.
Okay. And this is, once again, these are things you were told later. You were not realizing this as a 6-year-old.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And we'll, maybe I should ask you this. Going back to being that he's the one who said that she ran off with another man, did he give the state police any names at all?
I don't know if he knew the name, but he knew that there was a man at work that my mother was talking to. So there was a person who was named and investigated and was ruled out in the case. I don't know if my father knew him by name, but he knew that my mother was talking to another man. Now, the nature of the relationship, I don't really know. I just know he was much older, like 20 years older than her. And they had lunch together multiple times. And someone told my father that she was seen with this man. But this man was married with kids. And my understanding of the relationship was she adored him and he adored her. She was kind of, infatuated with him. And I think he adored her more, like wanted to help her out of this relationship that she was in that was so awful, and wanted good things for her. But I didn't get the sense that it was an active romance. It was just more like two people who really adored each other.
This was somebody she met in her job?
Yes. Okay. He was, I believe, an electrician at the hotel that she was cleaning rooms in.
Okay.
And somehow they connected and, took lunches together and that kind of thing. And it, I believe she had conversations with him about, a troubled marriage and she's unhappy. And, they probably just, commiserated over their issues or their marriage woes. But he was completely ruled out. And I don't know that my father gave the name, but he knew there was another person.
Okay, and like you said, maybe somebody saw them together. This wasn't something, I should say, that your mother told your father about?
No.
Your father found out about it through other channels?
Yes.
Okay.
Probably other people in the community or whatnot, but...
Okay. Could I don't know if I've ever asked you this, could your mother talk? Could she speak to people, even though she couldn't hear? Even though she couldn't hear, could she speak English? And
she could. How well, I don't know, because I don't have memory of her diction. But I do know that she went to Edinburgh University as a participant in a speech clinic. So there were speech and hearing majors at Edinburgh University, and she went for them to work with her to help her with pronunciation. So I know it was something she worked on.
Yeah.
So I think that people who knew her well probably could figure out what she was saying.
All right. I guess what I'm saying is, I'm guessing this electrician was not deaf.
He was not.
All right. So I start wondering. Right. So then I start wondering, well, were they communicating? And so she could talk, and maybe
she can read lips.
And she could read lips. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Gotcha. Okay. So what was left behind? Being your mother's went missing, she's still missing 40 years later. What was left behind of hers at her place? Maybe we should say things that would normally be with her.
So what was left behind was her hearing aid, which was something she never left home or anywhere without. Her keys to her car, her purse, her glasses. In fact, the only thing they say that was missing, that she may have been wearing or whatnot, was a pair of brown boots and a navy blue pea coat, and a pink blanket was missing. And the blanket was missing, that was reported by the babysitter.
Okay, so the babysitter noticed that was missing.
Yes.
All right. These hearing aids, and I had asked you about this in a previous conversation because I think this is very important. The way you understand it, for what reasons would your mother take her hearing aid out?
So during that time, technology was what it is now, and they would have to replace batteries probably relatively often, because they didn't make them long lasting. So when she would go to bed, when she would take a shower, would be the times that she would turn the hearing aid off and take the hearing aid off out of her ear to save on the life of the battery.
Okay.
So she would take it off to sleep. She would take it off to shower. Any other time, she would want that on.
Okay. So very rare that she had the
Very
hearing aid sleeping and in the shower. Everywhere else, just even at home, of course, at home, at work, driving somewhere, she'd be wearing it.
And she's also a mother of young children. So for that reason also, that's probably the first thing she would do when she woke up is put that on, just to be mindful of her children and any noises or anything that might be happening.
Okay. All right. So probably that's the most noteworthy thing because that's something that she would have on her almost all the time.
Right.
Right. In contrast to a purse, of course, in many disappearances we talk about, a woman goes missing, her purse is left behind, but a purse is not something that a woman technically wears. It's something that when they go somewhere, they put it on a table. They, maybe put it in a lock it away, maybe at work or something like that. But hearing aids, that's something that she would have been wearing.
And glasses.
And glasses too.
They weren't just reading glasses. She wore prescription glasses.
Okay. And then we have these brown boots and this coat as well. When you say pea coat, that's like a winter type of coat?
Right.
Okay.
Like a navy coat.
Yeah.
You know that.
Like sailors or Navy sailors,
yes.
would wear something like that. Okay,
right.
Gotcha. You mentioned this pink blanket. Do you specifically remember this pink blanket from living in that apartment?
I do have a vague memory of this blanket. This pink cotton blanket with the pink ribbon edging. I do recall it. My aunt told me, my mother's sister, Glennie, told me that she knew right away that was missing as well because it was a blanket that she used all the time when she was over there. Anytime she'd be over, she would grab that blanket, and it was like her favored blanket, and she would joke because my mother won it at some raffle or something, and she would joke, back and forth with my mother, like, it's mine, I'm the one that uses it, and she's like, no, it's mine, I won it, kind of thing. So it was also something that was on her radar right away, noticing that it was missing.
The way you know this blanket, is this one of those blankets that's like in a closet that you get out, when it gets colder in Pennsylvania, or was this like a blanket that would be used to maybe decorate a couch? What do you think? Was it something that was normally in the living area, or was it kind of stashed away? Do you know?
Most likely stashed away.
All right, stashed away. Okay.
Probably kept in a closet, pulled out when you wanted a blanket.
Okay, and like you said, it was the babysitter who actually recognized that it was missing.
Yes, right.
Right away. It sounds like she noticed very quickly.
Yes.
Okay, that next day when all the adults were over there. Sometime around then. Okay. Let's talk about this. Let's talk a little bit about the weather. I think this is something else we need to consider. We don't talk about the weather too much in disappearances, although we have one maybe being Chance Engelbert's disappearance that we covered earlier this year, where there was like a thunderstorm rolling in as he was walking around Gering, Nebraska. But let's talk a little bit about the weather. And I know this is going to sound weird to everyone, but both Allison and I have had problems actually trying to figure out what exactly the weather was that day. We've heard, you've of course told me that it was a snowstorm, but I don't know if there's technically proof of that. What can you say about the weather? What you've looked into, what you've tried to find out?
So not only did my parents live in that area, but many family members did. And I believe would be a cousin, actually ran a snowplow. Like, he was one of the snowplow drivers. And he said he literally drove right up the street in front of the duplex that we lived in on his way home after doing snowplowing. And he said, the snow was coming down and cars were pulling off the road because it was coming down so much. I mean, he used the word blizzard. And I have newspaper articles just from that talk about the disappearance that they literally in print call it a blizzard. But when I, 40 years later, have tried to look for a weather report, the nearest weather report that I can get online is in Erie, which is a good half hour from there, or Meadville, which is a good 15-20 minutes from there. And it said it was snowing, but not necessarily a blizzard. But this particular area is known to be a snowbelt area, and the newspaper, as well as family members that lived there, reported that it was a blizzard.
Right. I discovered the same thing. In fact, the word that I found, I was looking at Elwood City, which is kind of somewhat south of Meadville and Saegertown, but it's it's in that general area of western Pennsylvania. They called it flurries, which it's just hard to say. And what you're talking about, Allison, there is the lake effect that Pennsylvania gets from Lake Erie. And having gone to college up in Grove City, which is not far away from this area at all, I can remember getting some severe snowstorms when I went to Grove City. But in Leechburg, which is where I grew up, just an hour south of there, they wouldn't hardly get anything. So you're right. It's just a little unpredictable. And so it's just hard to say. But I think what we could say here, though, is it did snow. Snow did come down from the clouds. And do you know that when the police showed up, of course, all those people were already there, did they check for footprints? Did they see footprints of your mother's maybe wearing those boots, anything like that? Has that ever been brought up in the last 40 years?
I would assume they did. However, what I was told was that, it was drifting, snowing, blowing snow. So any footprints that morning, by the time they got there, or afternoon, I should say, would have not existed.
Okay, gotcha. And as we established earlier as well, the steps that go from the second floor down to the first floor are inside.
Exactly.
So they wouldn't have any snow on them anyway. So that maybe footprints from people on the first floor might get mixed in. That could happen too. All right, so and I have to bring this up because, as many of the many people in the audience know, I just testified. I guess an interview I did testify, and I didn't personally do much talking, but footprints in the snow played a part in a trial that I took part in Colorado in October. So, and that was a disappearance and ended up being a murder from 1984. So I was wondering if we might be able to apply a little bit of that to your mother's disappearance, but it doesn't seem so.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, we've almost touched this topic a couple times, but we're going to talk about it right now. And this has to do with the dollar amount of $60. Please tell this story to the listeners.
So I was told that my mother went to her father the day that she disappeared, like earlier in the day. So on January 6th, she disappeared officially on the 7th. On January 6th, she went to her father and asked for money, explained that she wanted to leave him. She didn't have money. She had bills to pay, needed to find a way out. And he, at the time, said, all I have on me is $60. This is it. And she said, thanked him, and off she went. Now, my grandfather would say, that money was for her to help her leave him. So fast forward to when the police were in the apartment, and my father was coming home from work with us, and he finds people in his apartment. He's angry. The police end up doing a search of his person and, find his wallet, search through his wallet, and find the $60. So at the time, I say this is $60, but it just happened to be $60. That was all that was in his wallet. And my grandfather, I'm sure, reacted and said, where did you get that money? Where did you get that money?
Sure.
And he volunteered to the police that Lonnie gave it to him, which never would have happened because that was not the intent of the money. She said, that she needed it to leave him. So why would she just say, oh, okay, here you go. let me just give this money to you I just got from my father to leave you. So it was found in his wallet and was a very suspicious piece of information.
So certainly the dollar amount is concerning, being that it is exactly the same dollar amount. Do you know if this was like 610s or 320s? Do we even know that? But it was, either way, it was $60 exactly.
Yeah, as far as the denominations, I don't know. But my father himself volunteered that that money came from her. So there wasn't a question about, I mean, even though the dollar amount could have been, money he got from anywhere, he himself volunteered that money came from her.
Right. Now, of course, what else we have to discuss is she wanted to leave your father?
Yes.
Why was that?
So he had a very long history of criminal behavior. He had been arrested numerous times and was actually in jail when my brother was born. He had charges that were theft, breaking and entering. He staged a robbery at a bar he was working at. And I believe that was the charge that he was in jail for when my brother was born. So, my mother's like this goody two-shoes, so to speak, and was never in trouble and everybody loved her. And then, she marries this bad boy who's always in trouble. And I'm sure she thought she'd change him, but the behavior didn't change. He continued to get caught and, was doing jail time. And she was embarrassed by it, and I think had just had enough. After trying to help him, change his life and turn his life around, he volunteered at the fire department that was literally across the street from where we were living, trying to turn things around according, to my mother's view. If he does these things that will help change him, well, then he stole tools from the fire chief because he had spent time in his garage and knew what was there. And then he broke in and stole tools from the fire chief, was caught. And that was it just was enough for my mother. And she was just done. Wanted better for herself, wanted better for her children, and was tired of being embarrassed by him. I know they argued a lot based on what the neighbors underneath said. So my hunch would be that they argued about this behavior and lifestyle that he lived, and she just wanted different.
Can you point to any particular, was there, do you think, a final straw? Given that she disappeared in the beginning of the year, in January of 1981, was this like turning over a new leaf and we're going to start 1981 right by leaving him? Or do you think there was some other sort of final straw that he got in trouble for something else? Have you ever been able to pinpoint that over the years?
Yes, actually. She had officially separated from him in October. So she asked him, this was after he got in trouble and, was arrested yet again for theft. She asked him to move out and said, go live with your parents. You can see the kids, but you can't stay here. And he obliged and went and stayed with his parents, who were living in Erie. So it's a good half hour, 40 minutes from where they were living. Holidays are approaching, and I'm sure that he came around often to see the kids, see her, and wanted to be back with her.
Sure.
She was feeling bad and felt like, this is the kid's father, and I don't want to keep their father from the kids. So tells him that he can come back for the holidays. Now, this is just before Christmas. Tells him he can come back for the holidays, but after the holidays, he's got to go. So he came, and after the holidays, she was like, okay, you got to go. And he refused.
He wasn't leaving.
He was not leaving.
And we have to keep in mind, you were like 5 or 6 years old at the time. Who's told you this?
This was told to me by her parents,
Your mother's
grandma,
parents,
grandpa,
your
and
grandparents.
my
Okay.
aunt.
Okay.
And my aunt was living near that area for quite a while and was kind of like my mother's confidant. They were very close.
All right. So there we have it. She was separated from him. In fact, he had left the apartment for a while. He came back for the holiday season, middle December to early January, and then we get to January 6th, January 7th. He's still there. He won't leave, and then she goes missing.
And I wouldn't doubt that part of their arguing that night was her saying, "You have to leave,"
Mm-hmm.
and he would
Okay.
not.
Okay. All right. So, and you just mentioned the neighbors. What did they say about that night?
The neighbors reported to the police that they heard yelling, arguing, banging into the wee hours of the morning. Wee hours meaning like, I don't know that a specific time was given.
Okay. The way you understand that apartment, would people in the first floor be able to hear when people from the second floor were coming and going?
I don't know for sure, but I know that the stairs run along the side of their apartment. So their one wall, whatever room it is, I don't know. The stairs are right next to it. I would think you would hear because the stairs are connected to their wall.
Right, and being that they could hear things going on upstairs, and having lived in apartments for most of my life, that's not unusual. Even when people aren't having arguments, when you have people walking on your ceiling, even as I live in this condo building in Clearwater Beach, which is a fairly nice place, when people are renting the place above me, you can hear them. You can hear them walking around. It's just part of, you just have to accept it. So they wouldn't even have to be arguing for them to hear, the people downstairs to hear your mother and your father upstairs, or you and your brother upstairs. But as far as coming and going, you think then there is a possibility that they could have heard somebody coming and going.
Could be.
Could. Okay. All right, so we have to keep that in mind. So they hear this stuff going on up there. Maybe they didn't think it was any different than any other time, but they never reported hearing anybody come downstairs,
Not
like
that
at
I'm
2 in the
aware of.
morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, anything to your knowledge.
Not to my knowledge. And again, they won't share the files with me, so it may be in there and I wouldn't know.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to talk about, we're certainly going to get to that because it's an interesting story. Okay, so once again, to put this in the timeline, she wants to separate from your father in October. He moves out, moves in with other family members. Just you, your brother, and your mother are there then all together at that location. Then she allows him to come back for the holiday season with the, I guess, the request that once the holiday season is over, once it becomes 1981, that he's supposed to go back where he came from. Yes. And he wouldn't do that. And then shortly after that, she goes missing. That's the timeline.
Correct.
All right. Let's talk a little bit more about you specifically, Allison. You, of course, had talked about, although you don't specifically have a memory of it, you being taken to the babysitters. You do remember that day, the next day later in the day, when all the adults are there, the police are there, and people are arguing. But eventually, your father took you and your brother, or maybe just you, but you can explain that to the listeners, to live with his sister. And it was like an on again, off again type of situation. Why don't you talk about that now?
Yes. So we were still in the apartment after the day after it happened, and I'm not sure, how many days, went by before he took us to his sister's, but I do know that he probably started to feel a lot of pressure from my mother's side, who was accusing him of doing something with my mother.
Sure.
And was tired of it and didn't want us around. So my aunt had taken me to the police to see if they could ask me anything or question, or if they could get anything from me. And they tried to hypnotize me, but I actually do have a memory of pretending to sleep because I didn't want to do it. And I would imagine a professional would realize that's what I was doing, but it didn't work.
Yeah, I'm not a big believer in that stuff anyway, but yes.
Yeah. But my father, I think, got wind of that, and that led to him saying, I'm taking them to my sister's. So we were then taken to my aunt, who lives probably 30, 40 minutes from where we were living. And I don't recall having any kind of relationship with her. I probably had only seen her a few times in my life. So when we went there, I was very traumatized. Besides the fact of what was going on in our lives, I did not want to be left with people I didn't really know, and was kicking and screaming, and my father left. So he left, and I would assume he went back to the apartment and did whatever he needed to do. But we were left with his sister for at least a year before he then came back and said, okay, I'm ready to be a dad now. Might have even been more than a year. And then, but each time he would come back and say, okay, I'm ready to be a dad, Children's Services would get involved because he was very abusive and neglectful. And then we'd get taken away, and then they would take us to my aunt because that's where we had been, and would say, he's got to do X, Y, and Z before he can have the kids back. And then he would get us back. And then it would just repeat again, and we would be taken away and go to my aunt. And when I say we, it was my brother and I all throughout my childhood. Up until 14. But, it was just a pattern of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And sometimes there were a couple times that it was foster care and then my aunt, or, a neighbor.
So I guess you were changing.
It was an on again and off again relationship.
So you were changing schools often then too?
Yes.
Oh my.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me ask you about this, though. I think this is very important. What would happen when your mother's side of the family would come around, like your mother's sister, who you've already mentioned? What would happen when they would want to see you? What would happen if they would ask you or bring up your mother in front of Clinton's side of the family? Let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. So I was not allowed, I was forbidden to talk to them. So throughout my childhood, there was maybe once or twice that my aunt actually was able to see us because she was so persistent, or would just show up. She lived 4 hours from where we were, so it had to be a pretty planned trip for her to, she had moved to Toledo, so she was nowhere near us. But I do have one or two memories of seeing her, but it was never alone. It was very supervised. We weren't allowed to talk about it, and I don't remember even having a conversation where we were told, we're not going to talk about this. You just knew you didn't. I mean, there was just a fear and anxiety of the topic, and I never point blank asked my father what happened, and we just didn't talk about it. I kind of found out what happened through listening to adult conversations and putting pieces together and knowing my own experience with my father and drawing my own conclusions, but we were not allowed to talk about it. And my mother's side, I did not know that they sent cards and letters and made phone calls trying to reach out to us, but I never knew that until I was much older and had pursued a relationship with my mother's side and found out from them that they sent cards with money and birthday cards and all kinds of things that I never saw.
Wow. Did your father's sister, I guess your aunt, did she ever in those years, once you got a little older, maybe to understand such things, did she ever express an opinion on what she believed happened to your mother?
Again, I don't recall ever actually having a conversation about it, and I left her care at 14. So I never had another conversation with her after that. Around that time, once again, I was removed from my father, and I was living with her, and then went back again when my father decided he wanted to be a dad again. So that move at 14 put me in a school system that I had already been in before. And there was a guidance counselor there who knew if I was back in the school system, that meant I was back with my father, and that was not a good thing because I had been taken away by Children's Services the last time. So she actually, called me into her office and, asked how things were doing. And I gave her the pat, I'm fine, things are fine answers, but she knew in her gut that it couldn't have been fine. So she said, listen, I'm going to give you my phone number. And if you ever need anything, this is my home phone number. You call me anytime, day or night, no matter what, no questions asked. And I was like, okay. So I put it in my pocket. Well, that exact night was my brother's birthday. And we were going to drive into Erie and go out to eat to celebrate his birthday. And my father told me I had to sit in the bed of the pickup truck. And my father, at that time, it was just a single cab. I don't think the quad cabs were even invented yet. But my brother, my father, and his girlfriend were in the cab. And he told me on a crisp October night in Erie, I had to sit in the pickup truck, and we drove a half an hour into Erie. Now, it was freezing, very cold, and at the wind of the drive. So I was banging, crying because I was so cold on the back window. He pulled into Erie Police Station, and I didn't know what was going on. He went in, came back out, said, let's go. And so I went into the police station, and the police officer looks at me and is like, can you hear? Are you hearing? And I said, yes. And he said, I don't understand. I don't understand what's going on. Can you help? So my father signs to me, tell him you're bad and I don't want you anymore. So I sign to the police officer. He says I'm bad and he doesn't want me anymore. And the police officer says, so what does he want us to do? So I sign, and my father says, I don't want her anymore. And the police officer says, okay, well, you can't just drop off kids here. We can get you help, but it's the weekend, because this was a Friday night. It's the weekend. We can get you help, but that won't be till Monday. Can you take her home for now, and we'll get somebody out to talk to you? I sign this to him, and he says, no, I'm not taking her home. The police officer says to me, well, do you know anybody you can stay with until Monday? Now, mind you, I'm a 14-year-old girl.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, you can call my aunt. That's always where they take us.
Yeah.
So he calls my aunt, and my aunt says, no, tell him I'm done. Figure it out. I'm not doing this again. So the police officer says, you know anybody else? And in anxiety, I just, put my hands in my pocket, and I felt that phone number. And I was like,
wow.
Well, here's the number of my teacher who said, she was my math teacher and my guidance counselor. And I said, she says if I need anything to call her day or night. And he's like, your teacher? And I said, yep, she told me to call. So he calls her, and she says, I'm on my way.
Wow.
And they got legal custody of me, and thanks be to God, I lived with them from 14 till 18 and went to college, and that's who I call family now. And that's how my brother and I were separated, because he was still with my father, because I was the one, being dismissed that night because it was my brother's birthday.
And your brother continued to live with your father, and I don't know if we want to get into that stuff because you weren't technically there. But when did he finally leave your father?
Well, the saga continued. It didn't change, and he was, in and out. But of course, my aunt said she wasn't doing it anymore. So he was, my father would abuse him, and he'd end up going to a friend's house. And I think more often than not, it was like, go to this friend's for a little bit and that friend's for a little bit. And eventually he just started living with a friend's family, and they got joint restraining orders against each other after my father threw him down a flight of stairs. So it didn't get better for him.
Wow. Okay. We have to give a shout out to this woman who helped you out in a time of need. What is her name, Allison? If you want to give her
Yes.
what is her
She
name?
is no longer with us. However,
Oh, I'm
the
sorry to hear
beautiful
that.
soul's name is Judy Dinsmore and William Dinsmore. And William Dinsmore is still alive, and I love him dearly.
Wow. Wow, that's a spectacular story within all the sadness and tragedy and everything,
Right?
for her to um, step up like that is so good. It's so good.
Absolutely. It truly saved my life, I'm quite sure.
Yeah. Wow.
Right.
But I do have to ask you about this. This is once again one of those things that I have to ask. But you had told me a story before. Of course, you were out of the house at 14. You had told me that your father would take you and your brother around, quote unquote, looking for your
Yes.
mother.
Mm-hmm. Often. Like he would tell us to get in the car and we would just drive endlessly, it seemed. I remember laying down with my brother, like on the back seat. It was a Bronco that he drove, and my brother and I would just lay down in the back. And I remember seeing highway lights, and every time we would go, I don't know where we would go. There was one time I remember going to Chautauqua, but we would just drive, and it was always we'd get on a highway or I'd see highway lights, and he'd say, "We're looking for your mother." And so it was like he just mentally would just keep telling us, keep looking for her, keep watching for her. Let's go find her. And Aaron and I were just tired of it, and most of the time we're just laying in the back seat and whatever we did. But he would do that, and I never really knew where he took us because we laid down in the back seat. And I'm not sure if he told us to do that or we just did that because we were tired. But yes, he would take us on these random road trips and say we're looking for her.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about your father specifically. That next day, the way you understand it, of course, she went missing the evening, the night of 6th, maybe 7th into the 8th. Was he late for work the next day? Do you even know?
No, I've been told that he arrived at work on time and didn't even tell anyone that anything was wrong.
Okay. Has anybody been able to trace his whereabouts after he dropped you off at the babysitter's at 3 in the morning?
Nope.
We have to remember that when your mother's side of the family got to the place later that day, it was, as you said, unusually pristine. Right?
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
All right, so we don't know what his whereabouts were from him dropping you off at roughly 3 a.m. to he having to be at work. I don't even know what time, maybe 7 or something. So we don't know
any. We also don't know when the argument ensued and how much time there was before he woke us up.
Okay. All right. I know you brought it up anyway already, but I'm going to ask you again anyway. For searches and anything that was done, did he participate in any of it, to your knowledge, back in 1981?
Not one. In fact, there were my mother's side of the family. A lot of them were involved in the volunteer fire department that was there, including my father. He was also a member of the volunteer fire department, but they all did searches in the woods behind the house where we were living, and it was reported that they watched him sitting in the window watching them all search, but did not participate. Not in one single search.
Okay. Did he have any friends that lived in the area? Would not mention any names, but did he have any friends who lived in the immediate area of where you lived in Hayfield Township?
I would not say, I'm not sure about the immediate area, but I do know he had some very good friends that would be maybe 30, 40 minutes from there.
Okay. What has he done?
40 minutes is in the direction of his work.
Okay. What has he done with his life since 1981? Of course, we know that you ended up at the age of 14 getting out of there. Unfortunately, your brother was with him for a bit longer. But once you two are out and about and gone, what has he done with his life since like the early 90s? Has he continued breaking the law like you said he did even before your mother went missing? What has he done? Do you have any contact with him? Anything?
So I have zero contact with him by choice. He did try to reach out to me once or twice, dropped a Christmas card off at my adoptive family's home, and I threw it away. So I never responded, never cashed the check, like none of that.
Wow.
Other than that, he really didn't, he's not tried to reach me. He did work that same foundry job that he was working the day of that disappearance. He worked there for 30 plus years.
Wow.
So to my knowledge, he must have been a good employee because they kept him all that time. And so he consistently and faithfully went to work and retired from that job. He always rented apartments and was not good at paying his rent on time. So I think he got booted out several times. Never owned a home, but I do believe he currently, just recently in the last year or so, purchased a home with a woman. And that's the first time I think he's owned a home. So as far as what he's done with himself, he's worked 30 years, owned a few dogs, and is currently owning a home.
Okay.
That's it.
But what about any criminal issues since the early 1990s?
None that I know of. Surprisingly, that has stopped, or he stopped getting caught, one or the other.
Okay. All right. And he worked that job, like you said, for all those years.
Right.
Did he continue to live in that same apartment for a while? Or did he move? What did he do after your mother went missing?
I think he lived there for a short time, but I can't imagine it was very long because her family lived all in that immediate area. Like literally 100 yards from that house or that apartment was my grandparents. So I don't think he stayed there long.
Okay. How I should ask you this. How is your brother doing?
He actually lives in Florida. You guys could be neighbors. Who
Wow.
knows? I know. He's doing very well. He has a family and has children, and you know, there are some lasting effects from his childhood and his experiences, but like myself, he longs to have some answers and to know where my mother is and offer her a proper burial. Neither one of us believe she's alive. That really has never been something either one of us have believed. It's just a matter of finding her.
Okay. Let's talk about some recent time stuff. You mentioned the police. Of course, we talked about them a fair amount of times. You had a meeting with someone at the Pennsylvania State Police, and they actually showed you the file, even though they would not allow you to look at it. Let's talk a little bit about that. When did that happen? How was that arranged?
So when I turned 18, the initial showing me the file happened then.
Oh,
when I turned 18, my adoptive mother Judy said, "Do you want to go and talk to the police and see what they know?" And at the time, I wasn't really sure I did want to know, but she did, so I was like, "Okay, let's go." And we went, and the police officer, I very vividly remember a big, thick, probably 3-inch binder sitting on a table in front of him. And he put his hand on the file, and he said, "Look, this is your mother's file." And like these words cut me. I have chills just saying it. He said, "We have everything we need in this file to convict your father of murder but a body. And without a body, we can't prove a crime was committed. Everything in this binder is circumstantial."
That's what the police told you. Of course, you would have been 18, so that would have been roughly 1995? 1994.
Yeah.
All right, so 27 years ago is what you were told. That's what you were told.
Yep.
Okay.
Directly to me, and we weren't allowed to see it. But he said everything in here, is circumstantial, but we can't do anything about it because we don't have a body. And at the time, emotionally, I was like, I can't do this. I did not invest in the case. I did not pursue, any leads. I wanted to make my mother proud, and my angle was very different. I wanted to become somebody who contributed to society positively, like my mother wanted, and that was how I was honoring her. But last January was the 40th anniversary of her disappearance, and something just clicked in me, and I decided it's time. It's been 40 years. It's time that somebody knows something, and my mother deserves that justice. And so I thought, I'm going to go and talk to them and see them, meaning the police, and find out where they're at with everything. And so I set up an appointment with the Meadville State Police, or Pennsylvania State Police. Meadville is the city. And I went and talked to them, and there was a young investigator that had just been put on the case. So over the years, it's turned over to many different people, and nobody has gotten any further in 40 years. Nothing has really led to anything that has brought them any closer to finding what happened. So this investigator we spoke with, I was super excited, thinking that, she's new and she's got great ideas, and, she's going to be vibrant. But what I kept hearing when she would give me an idea and say, I'm going to try this. I'm going to talk to this person. And I would say, talk to this person. This person was my father's girlfriend. Talk to her. And she would say, well, I will, but I'm actually not assigned. I'm assigned to this case as an overflow. I'm actually a sex crime investigator. So then it was, well, I have to do this job first, and I'll get to it when I have time, basically.
Yep.
And then it was, I think she started to get defensive, because I'm like, okay, it's been a week. Did you ever call that person? Did you ever? And then it became a little bit more hostile, where she was like, she literally told me she's gonna ask her supervisor to be removed from the case. I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to stop asking if you've done what you said you were going to do. So she was then removed, and another investigator was put on, and he was on for a couple months, and then they put another investigator on who is the current. So this is all within the last year.
Wow.
And in those jumps, 3 investigators in less than a year. It won't be a year till January. So 3 investigators, all of them have to get reacquainted with the case.
Yep.
And each one of them, I say, what's going on? What are you doing? And through that, each one of them have given me little bits and pieces of information that they thought I knew already, and that maybe I didn't. And I found out how many times they didn't follow a lead all the way through. How many times they didn't continue a search that was supposed to be done. How many times they didn't get an interpreter for an interview that they were supposed to, because they're deaf. They kept saying all along that my father refused to cooperate, and you can't force people to talk if they don't want to talk.
That's true.
And while I understand that's true, what they don't say is that the original investigator that I talked to in April said that my father agreed to talk to them, and for whatever reason, he said that he would talk to them, but they dropped the ball because they had to get a court-appointed interpreter. It couldn't be any interpreter, and they never got one, so they never interviewed him. So that experience is what I realized over and over and over again, things they didn't follow through, or things that they would say, oh, well, we have to get a warrant for that, or, we have to, wait for whatever. Or I'm busy with other cases. As soon as I finish this homicide, I'll do it. As soon as I finish this, I'll do it. And that do it never happens. In fact, the girlfriend that I said you need to go interview her died shortly after I said that.
Oh my.
So now she's gone. And these people are an older generation. My father's 72 years old. You can't, this is a time-sensitive case at this point, because they're all dying.
Yep, I know. Yes.
We're never going to know.
Yes.
And I'm sorry that you're overloaded and have all this work to do, but they're dying. So you're missing out on all those. I happily will say that the current investigator, I really respect. He listens, he follows through, he doesn't make excuses for being busy. You know, I have confidence in the current investigator, but the speed in which they've got to catch up is great. So we'll see.
All right, I think you've just encapsulated what most of my guests have talked about for the last 5 years. Changing of investigators every few months, not following leads, not realizing that many of these things are time sensitive, given how old the cases are. It's very common, unfortunately, very common. The Pennsylvania State Police, New York State Police, Florida State Police, you name it, it's happening everywhere, unfortunately, for sure. One more topic that I want to talk to you about is you were going to or did speak at a deaf club. Of course, we talked about that very early on in this conversation, but I would portray it, getting to do this was not as smooth as maybe I would expect. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I actually thought that I would be very welcomed, because these people that were there knew my mother. Some of them, not all, but several of them that were there knew my mother. My mother met my father at this club, so there was a lot of connection there. And I'm the child of this woman that has disappeared. So I really thought that I would be welcomed with open arms, and that, they would be very curious to know what I did with my life, and, whatever happened to that 6-year-old. But I would say, for the most part, I was welcomed when I finally got there. But getting there was, as you said, not as smooth. I did have a particular person that I won't name, but there was a deaf man who was friends with my father, who asked another deaf man to call me and tell me not to come. And so he called me on Facebook video, because then he could sign to me and said, "Hey, listen, we need you to cancel and not come, because we don't want to upset Bud," which is his nickname. "We don't want to upset Clinton." And I said, why is his concern greater than my mother's concern?
Right.
I don't understand why they were both members of the club. Why are you worried about him? How about my mother that's been missing for 40 years? And he said, "Yeah, we don't want to upset him." And I said, "Who?" And eventually he told me who it was. And I thought, that's interesting, because that person was good friends with my father. They went to the Pittsburgh School for the Deaf together. So I thought it was all very, very interesting, and have, I don't want to compromise the case at all, but there's a lot of questions unanswered with those connections that the police are currently pursuing. But that roadblock kind of soured the waters a little bit. I did persist, though, and I went, and I was so thankful I did. I stood in front of them. They brought one of their own interpreters, because I haven't signed regularly in years, so I'm rusty at best. And so I got up and I spoke from my heart. I told them, where I come from. I told them that I'm writing a book about my mother, and I'm close to releasing that I'm going to fight for her, and that I really wanted to bring justice to her, as well as to tell her story. And I was very well received by the crowd that was there. They were hugging, and even in Corona times, they were hugging, and, said that, we're so grateful that I came, and that I've grown up well, and all of that.
So is this the same club from like way back when your mother met your father? Same thing?
Yes. Same
wow.
And
like
I said that
almost
to
50
them.
years 50 years later.
Said, yes, and I said to them, my parents met here. How crazy is that they met here, and here I stand, all these years later as their daughter. Yes.
Your father's not a member of that club anymore? Does he not go there? Or did he just not show up that time, being that he knew you were going to be there, or what?
He moved 2 years ago, about 2 hours away from where this club is. So My understanding is he's not a current official member, but when they have their annual events, like other people are allowed to come, there was a summer party this past summer that he did go to. And I think I was at the September meeting. So when I went, it was in September, and I purposely did some homework to make sure he wasn't going to be there. And of course, he could have been there.
Yeah, he could.
Anyone was welcome to come, but thankfully he did not go to that particular meeting.
Did the guy who tried to get in the way of you speaking there did he end up being there or not?
He was not.
He was not. Okay.
Mm-mm.
Okay.
And he is a regular attending member, so it was unusual for him not to be there that night, but he did not come.
Okay, and when was this? Once again, when was this when you spoke to them?
September. This past September.
So just like 2 months ago.
Yeah.
Okay. And listeners should know we are doing this interview on November 13th of 2021. Okay. What's this been like for you, Allison? Of course, you have no contact with your father anymore. Were you technically adopted? What was the official paperwork regarding you and this teacher who took you in? Was it an official adoption, or what was it?
When I'm referring to it now, I always say I was adopted because it's just easier. But officially, the paperwork was they got legal custody.
Okay.
And the reason they went that route was they were afraid that they didn't want to upset my father and him like renege and not let them keep me. So they just went with the least path of resistance and said, that just turn custody over to us and let's move on.
Okay. So once again, what has this all been like? I know it's bad, but put it in your own words.
Well, my childhood was rough, but the neat thing, and actually, as I said, I'm writing a book. My resilience is strong, and I know that I get that from my mother. The book talks about my mother's resilience and being a deaf person and all the things that she overcame and refused to accept defeat. And I feel like that is also my story. And for me, a lot of horrible things happened, but a lot of good things happened too, like the guidance counselor. I wouldn't be here today talking to you and living this fight if it wasn't for, a woman who did not know me from Adam. We weren't related in any way, and took me into her home, and because of that stability, I was able to be where I am today. And I also say I credit my teachers along the way, giving me those stickers and those stars and giving me positive incentives to fight for, kept me on that right path. And rightfully so, I became a teacher myself. I am a special education teacher and have been for 21 years.
Wow.
So I followed suit, and I feel like I am the teacher I am because I can relate to these kiddos and what they really truly need, because I've been there. I mean, most of the time, when they're going through a struggle that is not in their control, it's something that I lived through. And I feel like that experience helps me to be a better teacher. And one of my mottos is rewrite the story. When life hands you something difficult, use it. I rewrite the story. So my past was pretty ugly, to say the least. But I'm rewriting the story today, and I am helping all of the cute kindergartners that I work with and first graders that I work with. And I am giving that love that I wished I had, and I know what I needed, to these kids that I work with today. And that's rewriting the story. It is a sad story, but it's also a story of resilience and championing over the ugliness. You can't overcome it. And I'm doing that in my mother's name.
Do you have a Facebook page, website, anything like that set up for your mother's disappearance?
I do. So it's called Justice for Lonene. Justice and for FOR, and Lonene is LONENE. And it's I set it up, I believe, in June.
Okay.
And we're at 1,500 members at the moment.
Wow. That's great.
So yes, there's a
Great.
lot of information on there, and as I'm very transparent on that page, and anything that is happening right now, as much as I can share, like some things with the case, if I'm going to compromise it, I certainly wouldn't share. But I really do. If you're interested in following along what's going on, I share a lot of what's going on, and I call the members of the page Lonnie's Angels, because we are her hands and feet on this earth to solve this. And I refer to all the members as Lonnie's Angels.
Huh. Well, that's neat. That's neat. Say it one more time for the listeners.
It's Justice for Lonene.
Okay.
The word justice, FOR, and then Lonene, LONENE, and no spaces.
I should ask you about that. Where did she get her name? That's another unique name for Unfound. It seems like we've been running to quite a few of them recently. Where does that name come from?
So my great-grandfather, her grandfather's name was Lonen, LONON. So they kind of made it a feminine form. So my grandfather's name was Lonene, and Lonene Smith, and they named her Lonene Ray, and the Ray was after her father. Mm-hmm. And I named my daughter, my middle daughter, is Maria Lonene, which is after my mother. So the name continues.
That's a unique one, Lonene.
It is.
Not too many Lonenes out there, I don't think.
No.
Love it. Okay. Allison, any final words before we complete this interview?
I really believe in my heart that we're going to find out what happened, and we're going to bring her to justice and offer the proper burial that she deserves. I really just encourage anyone listening that might have any knowledge of any sort, to come forward. Even if you're not sure if it is a meaningful piece of information, share it, and help us bring this case to close. I have never felt more positive about coming to a result in this case as I do now. There's been so many decades-old cases lately that are being solved, and I like to pray for and think that my mother's case will be one of them soon.
That's true. A lot. DNA, people coming forward. You're right. That is certainly true. Certainly true. Well, Allison, I know we will keep in touch, continue to keep in touch even after this episode comes out. I hope I can continue to help you in any way possible.
Thank you so much.
And I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And that was my November 13th, 2021 interview with Allison Diker, daughter of Lonene Rogers. I thank her for joining me and all of you on this episode. Before I get into my comments, I want to say how inspiring Allison's own story was. How a teacher took Allison at the age of 14 under her wing and raised Allison during a very tough time. We need more people like that teacher. Now, my summation. This is another one of those the man said types of disappearances. Clinton insists that Lonnie took off with another man at like 10 at night during what could have been a snowstorm. Yet Clinton has not given any names. He can't explain why Lonnie would have gone missing due to her allegedly running off. Clinton has given no reason why that $60 meant for Lonnie was in his wallet. On and on and on. This is just like Angela Green's disappearance, although I would say Lonnie's isn't quite as blatant. Either way, we know what happened. We know most likely why it happened. The big question then is, how do we use the information we have to prove what we think we know? So what information do we have? Hearing aids left behind. Brown boots missing. Blue pea coat missing. The neighbors although hearing many things many times, heard nothing this time. Clinton made it to work on time the next day, January 8th. The snow was not a help, unlike in Janelle Matthews' murder. It was early January in Pennsylvania, so the ground had to be hard. I'm sure you can come up with your own additional facts. The big issue is we usually think of these types of cases as spur-of-the-moment situations. And from that, I think the logic is, since the disappearance was unplanned, that the suspect had to have put the victim in a place that wouldn't be as hidden if it were planned. The problem, given what we know, the disappearance of Lonene Rogers could have been planned. Why? Because Clinton hadn't lived in the apartment for at least a month, and he had to know that eventually Lonnie would want him gone again, meaning he had that month to think about what he would do when Lonnie showed him the door in early 1981. It's something to consider as you analyze Lonnie's disappearance. This is as far as I will go with any kind of theorizing. You have the facts, you have a bit of my insight. Given how exasperated I think we all get with disappearances of this type, we know something, but we can't prove that something. I often feel like we're allowing these people to get away with it, like they're outsmarting us. And I would certainly love to rewrite that. I'll leave the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.